In 1966, Ford had a problem that didn't look like a problem at all. Sitting inside Ford Motor Company's enormous family of V8s was an engine that seemed to occupy the perfect middle ground. It had the bore of a 390. It had the long stroke of a 428. It displaced just over 410 cubic inches, and it could make the kind of low-end torque that hot rodders loved. But there was a catch. You couldn't walk into a Ford dealership and order one. The engine was reserved for Mercury, and for Ford enthusiasts, that made it something almost mythical. A big FE with more stroke than a 390, without stepping all the way up to the 428. A factory-built combination that looked like it had been designed specifically for someone who wanted to build a brutal street machine. Most people remember the legendary 390. They remember the 427. They remember the 428 Cobra Jet. But this forgotten V8 sits in the middle of that story. And what almost nobody realizes is just how clever the combination really was. The story begins in the early 1960s, when Ford's FE family was becoming one of the most important V8 platforms in America. The FE had arrived in 1958 as a 332 cubic inch engine, but Ford kept stretching and strengthening the architecture. There was the 352, then the 390, then the high-performance 406, and eventually the famous 427. The FE platform itself was a masterpiece of flexible engineering. Ford had created an architecture that could be expanded, modified, and reconfigured to meet almost any need. Need a truck motor? The FE could do it. Need a race engine? The FE could do that too. Need something for a luxury cruiser? Same basic platform, different calibration. The 390 became the workhorse. It was everywhere. Full-size Fords, trucks, Mercurys, police cars, performance packages. But hot rodders were always looking for the next step. The 390 used a 4.05-inch bore and a 3.78-inch stroke. That combination gave it 390 cubic inches. It was strong, torquey, and easy to find. Then Ford introduced something much more interesting. Instead of making the cylinders dramatically larger, engineers took the 390's 4.05-inch bore and paired it with a 3.98-inch stroke. That extra 0.2 of an inch doesn't sound like much. Inside 8 cylinders, it changed everything. The result was 410 cubic inches, or about 6.7 liters. And that 3.98-inch stroke was the key. The crankshaft came from the 428 family, which meant the 410 used the same basic long-stroke geometry as the larger engine. The 410 also used external balancing, just like the 428. In other words, this wasn't some completely new engine designed from scratch. It was a carefully engineered combination of existing FE hardware. And that was exactly what made it so fascinating. Because if you understood Ford's FE family, you could look at that engine and immediately see the possibilities. A 390 block, a 428 crank, a 4.05-inch bore, a 3.98-inch stroke. Put those numbers together and you get 410 cubic inches. The beauty of this combination wasn't just about displacement. It was about how that displacement was achieved. Engineers could have bored out the cylinders to make them wider. They could have created an entirely new casting. Instead, they did something smarter. They used parts that already existed in the Ford parts bin. But there was a problem. Ford didn't give America the version hot rodders really wanted. The factory 410 was offered in Mercury models for 1966 and 1967. It was equipped with a 4-barrel carburetor and carried a 10.5-to-1 compression ratio. Factory ratings put it at about 330 horsepower at 4,600 revolutions per minute. Torque was around 444 pound-feet at 2,800 revolutions per minute. And that torque number is the part people tend to overlook. 444 pound-feet at only 2,800 revolutions per minute. That wasn't an engine that needed to scream to get moving. It was an engine designed to shove. Step on the throttle in a heavy Mercury, and the long-stroke FE could build torque quickly. The piston traveled farther with every revolution than it did in the 390. That increased displacement without requiring the enormous bore of the 428. And for a streetcar, that mattered, because horsepower wins arguments at the top of the tachometer. Torque wins arguments when the light turns green. The difference between horsepower and torque isn't just academic. Torque is what you feel pushing you back in the seat. It's what launches the car off the line. It's what makes a heavy vehicle feel alive when you need to merge onto a highway or pass someone on a two-lane road. The 410's long stroke gave it a mechanical advantage in producing exactly that kind of grunt. But the 410 had another advantage. It was based on a platform hot rodders already understood. The FE wasn't some exotic European engine with expensive parts and strange engineering. It was a big American V8 with enormous aftermarket potential. The architecture was familiar. The 390 was already popular. The 428 was already desirable, and the 410 combined characteristics of both. You can probably see where this is going. If Ford could build this engine for Mercury, why couldn't Ford enthusiasts get the same thing in a Ford? Why wasn't there a factory 410 Galaxy? Why wasn't there a factory 410 performance package? Why didn't Ford take this combination and turn it loose on the hot rodding world? The answer has less to do with engineering than you might expect. It had to do with marketing. By the middle of the 1960s, Ford's engine lineup was becoming crowded. The company had the 390 for mainstream buyers, the 428 was positioned above it, and for serious performance, there was the 427. Ford's marketing strategy required clear differentiation between models. Each engine had to have a purpose. Each displacement had to occupy a specific position in the hierarchy. Too many similar options would confuse buyers and cannibalize sales from other models. Then there was Mercury. Mercury needed its own identity. That mattered because Mercury wasn't simply a Ford with different badges. Ford Motor Company wanted Mercury to occupy its own space between Ford and Lincoln. Unique engine combinations were one way to make that happen. Mercury had always struggled with identity. It was positioned as more upscale than Ford, but less expensive than Lincoln. That middle position was difficult to define. Buyers needed reasons to choose Mercury over a top-trim Ford. Exclusive engines were one answer. So the 410 became a Mercury engine, not a Ford engine. And that decision gave the 410 one of the strangest reputations in the entire FE family. It wasn't rare because it was an exotic racing engine. It was rare because Ford never really gave it the chance to become common. And then the hot rodding world did something Ford probably didn't expect. It started building its own versions, because the basic recipe was sitting right there. If you had a 390 FE block, the long-stroke crankshaft concept was already proven. The 428 crank had the 3.98-inch stroke needed for the combination. The result was essentially the same fundamental bore and stroke formula. That's why the 410 became so interesting to engine builders decades after it disappeared from showrooms. It wasn't just a forgotten factory engine, it was a blueprint. And this is where the story gets really interesting. The FE family was famous for sharing components across different displacements. Ford could create different engines by changing bore, stroke, crankshaft, pistons, heads, compression, camshaft, and induction. The 410 was one of the clearest examples of that philosophy. The 390 gave you the 4.05-inch bore and a 3.78-inch stroke. The 428 gave you the longer 3.98-inch stroke and a larger 4.13-inch bore. The 410 sat between them, same basic 390 bore, 428 stroke, 410 cubic inches. It was almost like Ford had accidentally created the perfect hot rod recipe, and once enthusiasts understood that formula, they could recreate it. The parts were available, the combination was proven. All you needed was the knowledge and the willingness to assemble the components yourself. That accessibility is what separates American V8s from many other performance engines. You didn't need factory authorization to build a 410, you just needed the right parts. But there was another reason the 410 didn't become a performance legend. The factory version wasn't built as a racing engine. That distinction matters. Ford's serious competition engines were different animals. The 427 had specialized blocks, stronger internal components, and configurations developed specifically for high-performance applications. Some versions used cross-bolted main bearing caps, forged components, and specialized cylinder heads. The 410 wasn't that. It was a street engine. A very strong street engine, but still a street engine. Its 10.5-1 compression ratio was respectable for the era. Its 4-barrel carburetor gave it breathing capacity, and the long stroke produced substantial torque. But the factory's 330 horsepower rating tells you where Ford intended it to live. This wasn't supposed to be the engine that terrorized NASCAR. It wasn't supposed to win Le Mans. It wasn't supposed to replace the 427. It was supposed to move big Mercury cars with authority, and that's exactly what it did. For a buyer in 1966, the 410 was a fascinating compromise. You didn't necessarily need the expensive, high-strung hardware of a 427. You didn't have to settle for the smaller 390. And you got a substantial torque advantage from the longer stroke. The buyer who chose a Mercury with the 410 was probably someone who understood engines, someone who recognized that the numbers told a specific story, someone who valued low-end torque over peak horsepower. But then came the question every hot rodder eventually asks: what happens if you build it? That's where the factory specifications stop being the end of the story. A 410 can be treated as a starting point rather than a final destination. Modern builders can use improved pistons, camshafts, cylinder heads, intake manifolds, carburetors, exhaust systems, and ignition systems to extract far more power than the original factory calibration. And that's important because the original 330 horsepower figure doesn't tell you what the architecture was capable of. It tells you what Mercury sold. Those are two very different things. The long stroke gave the engine a strong torque foundation. The FE's large physical size gave builders room to work. And the shared parts relationship between the 390, 410, and 428 made the platform unusually attractive to enthusiasts who understood Ford's engineering. Modern engine builders have taken the 410 concept and pushed it far beyond factory specifications. Better cylinder heads flow more air. Aggressive camshaft profiles change the power delivery. Higher compression pistons extract more energy from every combustion cycle. But there was a price for that extra stroke. A longer stroke means the piston travels farther for every revolution. At the same RPM, the piston is moving faster on average. That increases mechanical stress. It also changes the character of the engine. A short-stroke engine can be more comfortable living at high RPM. A long-stroke engine tends to make its personality lower in the rev range. That's why the 410 was never really about screaming to the moon. It was about making the car move. And in a full-size American car weighing thousands of pounds, that mattered. Imagine sitting behind the wheel of a big Mercury in 1966. The hood stretches out in front of you. The engine is idling through a 4-barrel carburetor. You press the accelerator. The tachometer doesn't need to climb dramatically. The car simply starts pushing, and then the road disappears behind you. That's the appeal of the 410, not necessarily the highest horsepower, not the biggest displacement, not the wildest race credentials. The combination. It was the combination hot rodders understood immediately. But just as enthusiasts were discovering what could be done with these engines, Ford's FE lineup was changing again. The 428 was becoming increasingly important. Performance buyers were looking toward bigger and more specialized engines. The 427 had already established its racing reputation, and the 410 had a very small window. That's essentially it for its factory passenger car life. 2 model years, then it was gone. And that short production run is one of the reasons the engine became so easy to overlook. Think about how unusual that is. The 390 had a long production history. The 428 became legendary. The 427 became a racing icon. The 410 appeared, made its case, and disappeared. No decades-long production run, no famous Cobra Jet badge, no massive racing mythology. Just 2 years in Mercury cars. And yet, underneath the forgotten name was an engineering formula that enthusiasts could still understand. A 4.05-inch bore, a 3.98-inch stroke, 410 cubic inches, 10.5-1 compression, about 330 horsepower, roughly 444 pound-feet of torque. Those numbers don't sound revolutionary today. In 1966, inside a large American car, they were serious hardware. The typical family sedan was making maybe 200 horsepower. Performance cars were starting to push beyond 300. But engines making more than 400 pound-feet of torque were still relatively uncommon outside of truck applications. The 410 delivered that torque in a package designed for regular street use. And there's something else that makes the 410 story so compelling. It exposes a misconception about old muscle car history. People often imagine that every great engine was deliberately designed to become a legend. That's not how it works. Sometimes the interesting engines are the ones that never got the marketing campaign, the ones that didn't receive the racing program, the ones that existed for a couple of years before the company moved on. The 410 was one of those engines. Ford didn't need it to become famous. Mercury needed another big V8, so Ford gave Mercury one, and then the production line moved forward. But enthusiasts didn't forget, because once you understand what the 410 really was, you start seeing why it remains fascinating. It wasn't simply a 390 with a bigger number on the air cleaner. It wasn't a 428 with a smaller bore. It was a deliberate combination of two proven FE dimensions, the 390 bore, the 428 stroke, and that combination produced something with a very specific personality. Massive low-end torque, big block durability, a familiar FE architecture, and enough breathing room to become something much more serious in the hands of a skilled builder. That is the hidden truth behind the story. The engine wasn't a secret masterpiece that Ford refused to sell to every hot rodder in America. The reality is more interesting. Ford built it, Ford sold it, but Ford kept it inside Mercury's lineup and gave it almost no chance to become the mainstream performance weapon enthusiasts imagined. And because it disappeared after only 2 model years, the legend grew in the garage rather than on the showroom floor. Today, you can look at a 410 FE and see more than an obscure factory engine. You can see a snapshot of an era when manufacturers could create an entirely different personality simply by changing the crankshaft and displacement, before electronic engine management, before computer-controlled variable valve timing, before turbochargers became normal on family sedans. Engineers were making personality with inches of cast iron and steel. The relationship between bore and stroke determined character. A short stroke and large bore created an engine that loved to ref. A long stroke and smaller bore created an engine that made torque down low. Engineers couldn't reprogram software to change power delivery. They had to design it into the physical dimensions of the engine itself. And the 410 is one of the cleanest examples. It proves that sometimes the most interesting engine isn't the one with the biggest horsepower number. It's the one that makes you ask, what if? What if Ford had put it in the Galaxy? What if it had received a serious performance package? What if hot rodders had gotten a factory version with better heads, a more aggressive cam, higher flow induction, and freer exhaust? What if Ford had marketed it as the blue-collar alternative to the expensive 427? Maybe the 410 would have become a household name. Maybe it would have disappeared anyway. We'll never know. And that's exactly why the engine remains so fascinating, because Ford didn't kill some legendary race motor. They simply stopped building an unusually clever combination before the enthusiast world had a chance to turn it into something much bigger. The 410 was born from the 390, borrowed the long stroke of the 428, and landed in a narrow space between everyday big block power and Ford's serious performance machinery. It made roughly 330 horsepower and 444 pound-feet in factory form. But its real appeal was the architecture underneath: a 4.05-inch bore, a 3.98-inch stroke, 410 cubic inches, a forgotten combination that hot rodders could understand the moment they saw it. And maybe that's why this engine still matters. Because sometimes the engines that become legends aren't the ones Detroit intended to make famous. They're the ones enthusiasts discover after the factory has already moved on. The ones that exist in service manuals and parts catalogs but never got the spotlight. The ones that prove you don't need a massive marketing campaign to build something interesting. You just need the right combination of existing parts and the willingness to try something different. That's the lesson of the 410. It wasn't exotic, it wasn't revolutionary, it wasn't even particularly rare when it was new, but it was smart, and decades later, that smartness is what enthusiasts remember.